Today, we are diving deep into the origin story of psychology, a science that, believe it or not, started with a really fundamental question about the human soul. We're going to go on a journey from ancient philosophy all the way to modern neuroscience to figure out how we even started trying to scientifically study our own minds.
And really, this isn't the question that started it all. The word psychology literally means study of the soul. But think about it. How do you scientifically measure a soul? How do you put something that's not physical under a microscope? For centuries, this exact problem kept the study of the mind locked firmly in the world of philosophy.
So to really get how we went from studying the soul to studying the brain, we need to go back in time. Yeah, way back. Long before there were any labs or experiments, the biggest questions about our minds, our consciousness, and our very identities were being debated by philosophers.
All right, our first stop takes us to a world of pure reason and thought. Before any labs, before any experiments, there were these thinkers who were just trying to puzzle out the nature of the mind using logic alone. And one figure, in particular, really stands out for setting the stage for everything that came after.
And that figure is the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. Back in the 17th century, the word psychologist didn't even exist, but the central puzzle he created would go on to define the field for the next 400 years.
What made Descartes so important is that he was really the first person to lay out a systematic theory of how our minds and our bodies are related. He basically argued that the universe was made of two fundamentally different things, the physical world of matter and the non-physical world of thought.
And that brings us to his most famous idea, mind-body dualism. For Descartes, the body was just a physical machine, kind of like a complex clock. It operated according to the laws of nature. But the mind? Oh, that was something else entirely, a non-physical thing of pure thought. He believed they were totally separate, only interacting through a tiny part of the brain called the pineal gland. But here's the really revolutionary part. Descartes also gave us a way to study the body scientifically. He came up with a concept of the reflex, the idea that an external event, like touching a hot stove, could trigger an automatic physical reaction without even involving the mind. This meant that at least some of our behavior was mechanical and predictable, and that opened the door for it to be studied just like any other natural phenomenon.
So, for 200 years, philosophers just argued back and forth about Descartes' dualism. But a massive shift was on the horizon. We're now moving from the philosopher's armchair to the scientist's laboratory. This is the moment psychology formally breaks away and becomes its own thing.
Okay, if there is one date you remember from this whole story, make it this one, 1879. This is year zero for scientific psychology. It is the year everything changes. Over in Leipzig, Germany, a scientist named Wilhelm Wundt took a monumental step. We now call him the father of psychology, and for good reason. He opened the world's very first experimental laboratory dedicated exclusively to studying the mind. For the first time ever, psychological questions would be answered not with logic, but with actual empirical data.
Wundt's approach was called structuralism, and his goal was incredibly ambitious. He wanted to create a kind of periodic table of consciousness. Just like a chemist breaks down water into hydrogen and oxygen, Wundt wanted to break down our conscious experience into its most basic parts. His main tool was introspection, where he'd train people to report their precise mental experiences. The problem was, it was deeply subjective. Different people reported different things, which created a massive opening for a new and much more radical approach.
So psychology is officially a science, but almost right away, a huge fight breaks out. The 20th century basically becomes this battleground of competing ideas about what psychology should even be a science of.
On one side of this battle, you've got Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud wasn't working in a lab. He was with patients in his clinic, and he argued that Wundt's focus on conscious experience was completely missing the point. He proposed that the most important parts of our minds are totally hidden from us, in this deep, turbulent place called the unconscious, which was filled with all our repressed desires and memories.
And this right here sets up the biggest showdown of the early 20th century. In one corner, you have Freud's psychoanalysis, diving deep into that inner, unseen world. And in the other corner, you have behaviorism. Behaviorists like John B. Watson were just horrified by all this talk of unseeable things. Their motto was simple: if you can't observe it and measure it, it's not science. Forget the mind, they said, let's only study behavior.
There's this famous quote that just sums up the whole journey perfectly. Psychology started by losing its philosophical soul to become a science.
Then, with the behaviorists, it lost its mind and consciousness to focus only on what you could see. It was this dramatic journey away from its own origins.
But hold on, the story doesn't end there. After decades of focusing only on behavior, technology and new ideas finally gave scientists the tools they needed to bring the mind, and the brain itself, back into the picture, and to do it scientifically.
This big comeback happened in two major waves. First, in the 1960s, you have the cognitive revolution. Psychologists started using the new language of computers to create models of how things like memory and attention work. The mind was back, but now it was reframed as a kind of information processor. Then, in the 80s, the biological approach took it a step further. With new tools like brain imaging, we could finally open up that black box and actually see the brain at work, linking our thoughts and feelings directly to what was happening in there.
What an incredible journey, right? We went from Descartes separating the mind and body to once making it an official science in 1879. Then we had that 20th century battle between Freud's unconscious and Watson's observable behavior, and finally the cognitive and biological revolutions bringing the mind and brain back together for real scientific study.
Which leaves us with a final fascinating question. We've journeyed all the way from pure philosophy to the intricate neuroscience of the brain. The study of the human mind is always evolving. So what do you think the next great chapter in this story is going to be?